The wooden wheels of the stagecoach creaked and groaned as they rolled over the dusty main street of Willow Creek, Montana. Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her face against the small window, watching the unfamiliar landscape roll by. Everything looked so different from the crowded streets of Massachusetts she had left behind just 2 weeks ago. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the worn leather handle of her carpet bag. Inside that bag was everything she owned in the world: 2 simple dresses, her mother's rosary beads, a small Bible, and the stack of letters tied with blue ribbon. Those letters had brought her here, thousands of miles from home, chasing a dream that seemed almost too good to be true. Harold Pemberton had written such beautiful words. He painted pictures of a comfortable life in his letters, describing his successful general store and his large house on the hill overlooking the town. He spoke of wanting a refined wife to share his prosperity, someone who could help him rise in society as the town grew and prospered. Margaret had been honest in her own letters. She told him about working in the textile mills since she was 14, how she had learned to read and write from the Irish priest who visited the workers' quarters, and how she had saved every penny she could for 6 long years. She mentioned her calloused hands and her simple background, but somehow she thought he understood. His letters never seemed to mind. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the Willow Creek Hotel, and Margaret's stomach dropped. This was it. After months of planning and dreaming, she was finally here to meet the man who might become her husband. She stepped down from the coach, her legs shaky after days of travel. The late afternoon sun beat down on her dark wool dress, the nicest one she owned. She had scrubbed her hands until they were raw, trying to soften the rough calluses, and pinned her auburn hair as neatly as she could manage. A tall man in a fine suit waited on the hotel porch. Harold Pemberton looked exactly like the photograph he had sent. Well-groomed mustache, expensive clothes, and an air of importance about him. But when his eyes met hers, something cold flickered across his face. Margaret walked toward him with as much confidence as she could gather. "Mr. Pemberton, I'm Margaret O'Sullivan." Harold's gaze traveled from her face down to her hands, then back up again. His smile seemed forced. "Miss O'Sullivan." "Yes, You've had a long journey." They stood there for an awkward moment. Margaret had imagined this meeting so many times, but never like this. She had expected warmth, maybe even excitement. Instead, Harold looked like a man who had made a terrible mistake. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Harold said, glancing around at the curious faces watching from the hotel porch and the street. Small towns loved their gossip, and a mail-order bride was certainly something worth talking about. He led her to a small parlor inside the hotel. Margaret sat on the edge of a velvet chair, her back straight despite her exhaustion. Harold paced by the window for a moment before turning to face her. "Miss O'Sullivan, I must be direct with you. When we corresponded, I perhaps didn't fully understand your background." Margaret felt her cheeks burn. "I told you I worked in the mills, Mr. Pemberton. I was honest about my circumstances." "Yes, but I didn't realize—" He gestured vaguely at her hands, her dress, her accent. "You see, my position in this community requires a certain type of wife. Someone who can host dinner parties, manage social functions, represent my business interests properly." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She had known she wasn't fancy, but she had hoped her honesty and willingness to work hard would matter more than her rough edges. "I can learn," she said quietly. "I'm not stupid, Mr. Pemberton. I can read and write better than most. I managed the boarding house accounts back in Lawrence when Mrs. Murphy was sick. I know how to keep books and deal with suppliers." Harold waved his hand dismissively. "It's not about intelligence, Miss O'Sullivan. It's about breeding, about social position. The ladies in this town, well, they have certain expectations." Margaret stood up slowly, her pride keeping her spine straight even as her heart crumbled. "I see. So what happens now?" "I've arranged a room for you at Chen's boarding house. It's respectable enough. I'll pay for your return passage to Massachusetts, of course. The next stagecoach east leaves in 3 days." 3 days. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had burned every bridge to come west. She had quit her job at the mill, given up her tiny room in the tenement, spent nearly all her savings on the journey. Going back meant starting over with nothing. "That's very generous of you," she managed to say. Harold looked relieved. "I do hope you understand. It's nothing personal. You seem like a decent woman, just not suitable for my particular situation." Margaret picked up her carpetbag and walked toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she turned back. "Mr. Pemberton, in your letters you wrote about wanting someone genuine, someone who understood the value of hard work. Was any of that true?" Harold had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Perhaps I was more romantic in my correspondence than realistic about my actual needs." Margaret nodded once and left the parlor. She walked through the hotel lobby with her head high, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by tomorrow morning everyone in Willow Creek would know that Harold Pemberton had rejected his mail-order bride. The boarding house sat at the end of Main Street, a two-story building that had seen better days but was clean and well-maintained. A small Chinese woman answered Margaret's knock on the door. "You must be Miss O'Sullivan," she said in accented but clear English. "Mr. Pemberton sent word you would need a room. I am Mrs. Chen." Margaret followed Mrs. Chen up a narrow staircase to a tiny room under the eaves. It contained a single bed, a washstand, and a small window that looked out over the mountains in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was clean and private. "Supper is at 6, Mrs. Chen said. "Breakfast at 7. You pay by the week." Margaret sat on the narrow bed after Mrs. Chen left, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had come so far, risked everything, and it hadn't been enough. Harold's words echoed in her mind. Not suitable, wrong, breeding, lacking the proper social position. But as she sat there in the growing twilight, something else stirred inside her alongside the hurt and disappointment. Margaret O'Sullivan had survived the death of both parents, had worked brutal hours in dangerous conditions, had saved and planned and dreamed her way across a continent. She wasn't going to let one man's narrow vision of what made a suitable wife destroy her completely. She opened her carpetbag and pulled out the small notebook where she kept track of her money. After paying for 3 days at the boarding house and the return stagecoach ticket Harold had arranged, she would have exactly $4.37 left to her name. It wasn't much, but it was something. And Margaret had learned, long ago, how to make something into more than enough. She just had to figure out how to do it in a place where everyone already saw her as the woman who hadn't been good enough. Outside her window, the lights of Willow Creek began to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there was her future, whatever it might look like. It certainly wasn't what she had planned, but Margaret had learned that life rarely went according to plan anyway. The important thing was not to give up. Tomorrow, she would start, figuring out how to build a life in this strange new place, one day at a time. Margaret woke before dawn on her first morning at the boarding house. The small room felt strange and cold, nothing like the cramped but familiar tenement back in Massachusetts. She could hear Mrs. Chen moving around downstairs, preparing breakfast for the other boarders. Her stomach growled loudly. Yesterday had been such a whirlwind of disappointment that she had barely eaten anything. The return stagecoach ticket Harold had purchased sat on her washstand like a constant reminder of her failure. 3 days, he had said. 3 days to figure out what came next. Margaret dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. The dining room held 6 mismatched tables, most already occupied by working men who paid little attention to her entrance. She recognized the type from her mill days: laborers, drifters, men who worked hard for their daily bread and minded their own business. Mrs. Chen appeared from the kitchen carrying a plate of eggs and bacon. "Sit anywhere you like," she said to Margaret. "Breakfast comes with the room." Margaret chose a small table near the window and ate slowly, making the food last. She watched the town come alive outside. Shopkeepers opening their doors, women hanging laundry, children running to school. It all looked so normal, so peaceful. Nothing like the industrial chaos she had grown up with. "You're the one, Pemberton. Sent away, aren't you?" Margaret looked up to find a middle-aged man with calloused hands standing beside her table. His tone wasn't unkind, just curious. "I am," she said simply. "Figured as much." I'm Pete. Work at the lumber mill outside town. Heard all about it at Murphy's Saloon last night. He sat down without invitation. Pemberton's telling everyone you weren't refined enough for his taste. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. I suppose that's his right to say, Pete snorted. Refined. Man thinks awful highly of himself for someone who sells beans and flour. He studied her face for a moment. What you planning to do now? I don't know yet, Margaret admitted. Mr. Pemberton bought me passage back east, but I'm not sure I want to use it. Smart girl. Nothing back there but the same old struggles. Out here, a person can make something of themselves if they're willing to work. Pete stood up, fishing coins from his pocket for his breakfast. Mrs. Chen could probably use help around here. Woman works herself half to death keeping this place running. After Pete left, Margaret sat thinking about his words. She finished her breakfast and found Mrs. Chen in the kitchen washing dishes in a large metal tub. Mrs. Chen, could I speak with you for a moment? The older woman dried her hands on her apron and turned around. What is it, dear? I was wondering if you might need help around the boarding house. I'm good with cleaning, and I can cook simple meals. I managed accounts for a boarding house back in Massachusetts when the owner was ill. Mrs. Chen studied her carefully. What about your ticket home? I'm thinking maybe I don't want to go home just yet. A small smile crossed Mrs. Chen's weathered face. The work is hard. Up before dawn, cleaning rooms, washing linens, serving meals. Some of the men can be difficult. And I can't pay much, just room, board, and a few dollars a week. That's more than I have now, Margaret said honestly. All right then. We'll try it for a week and see how it goes. Margaret threw herself into the work with an energy that surprised, even her. Years in the textile mills had taught her efficiency and attention to detail. She could strip and remake beds faster than Mrs. Chen had ever seen, and her method for washing and hanging laundry cut the drying time in half. By the end of the first week, Mrs. Chen was impressed enough to make the arrangement permanent. Margaret moved her few belongings to a slightly larger room on the second floor and settled into a routine that felt familiar and comforting after the uncertainty of her first few days. But living in a small town came with challenges she hadn't expected. Every time she walked to the general store for supplies, she could feel eyes watching her. Whispers followed in her wake. The respectable ladies of Willow Creek had decided she was beneath their notice, while some of the men seemed to think her rejection by Harold meant she was available for less honorable arrangements. The worst was when she encountered Harold himself. He would nod politely when their paths crossed, as if nothing had happened between them, as if he hadn't crushed her dreams and left her stranded in a strange place. Margaret learned to hold her head high during these encounters, but they still stung. One afternoon, while hanging laundry behind the boarding house, she overheard two women talking as they passed by the fence. Such a shame about that Irish girl, one was saying. Though I suppose Harold was right to send her away. Can you imagine her trying to host a dinner party? I heard she's working as a cleaning girl now. Probably where she belongs, really. Margaret's hands stilled on the clothesline. Part of her wanted to march over and tell them exactly what she thought of their opinions. But she had learned long ago that defending yourself to people who had already made up their minds was a waste of breath. Instead, she focused on proving them wrong through her actions. Mrs. Chen had been keeping the boarding house accounts in a jumbled mess of receipts and scraps of paper. Margaret organized everything into neat columns, tracking income and expenses with the precision she had learned from managing her own meager finances. When Mrs. Chen saw the organized books, her eyes widened. You did all this? Numbers don't lie, Margaret said, and they tell stories if you know how to read them. You're losing money on your grocery purchases because you're buying small quantities too often. If you buy larger amounts less frequently, you'll get better prices. Mrs. Chen studied the figures Margaret had written out. You're right, but I don't have the money to buy large quantities up front. What if we talk to the suppliers about credit terms? Your business has been steady for 3 years. They might be willing to work with you. Within a month, Margaret had negotiated better deals with 3 different suppliers and reorganized the boarding house operations to run more efficiently. The extra income meant Mrs. Chen could afford small improvements: new curtains for the dining room, better quality coffee for breakfast, repairs to the front porch that had been sagging for 2 years. Word began to spread about Margaret's skills. With numbers and organization, Mrs. Peterson, who ran the town's small restaurant, asked if Margaret could look at her books during her free time. Then old Mr. Jenkins, who owned the hardware store, wanted help figuring out why his inventory never seemed to match his sales. Margaret took on these extra jobs gladly. Each one meant a few more coins in her pocket and proof that she had value, beyond what Harold Pemberton had been able to see. She was building something here, creating a place for herself through competence and hard work. But it was lonely work. The respectable ladies still avoided her, and she was too tired most evenings to socialize with the other working people in town. She spent her free time reading books borrowed from the tiny town library or sewing by lamplight, mending clothes for other boarders in exchange for small payments. Sometimes, late at night in her small room, Margaret wondered if she should have taken that stagecoach ticket back east. Life would have been familiar there even if it was difficult. Here she was building something new, but she was building it alone. Still, when she looked at her neat account books and the small pile of coins growing in her dresser drawer, she felt a pride she had never known in the mills. This was hers. Every penny earned through her own efforts, every small success built on her own decisions. Margaret O'Sullivan was learning that sometimes the best revenge against those who underestimate you is simply refusing to prove them right. Margaret first noticed the tall, quiet man on a Tuesday morning in early September. She was walking back from the general store carrying a heavy sack of flour for Mrs. Chen when she stumbled on the uneven wooden sidewalk. The flour sack slipped from her arms, and she braced herself for the mess it would make when it hit the ground. Instead, strong hands caught the sack before it could fall. Margaret looked up to see a man with kind brown eyes and sun-weathered skin. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with the solid build of someone who worked outdoors. His clothes were clean but simple, sturdy work pants and a cotton shirt that had seen many washings. "Careful there," he said, steadying the flour sack in her arms. His voice was deep but gentle. "Thank you," Margaret managed, suddenly aware of how she must look. Her sleeves rolled up, her hair escaping from its pins, clearly doing manual labor in the middle of town. The man tipped his worn hat. "Thomas Brennan," he said simply. Margaret. "O'Sullivan." Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Everyone in town knew her story by now. But instead of the judgment or pity she had grown used to seeing, Thomas just nodded respectfully. "You take care now, Miss O'Sullivan," he said, and continued on his way toward the general store. Margaret watched him go, puzzled by the encounter. Most men in town either ignored her completely or looked at her with expressions that made her skin crawl. Thomas had looked at her like she was just another person deserving of basic courtesy. Over the following weeks, she began to notice him more often. He came to town every couple of weeks, always alone, always polite but quiet. He would buy supplies at the general store, sometimes stop at the blacksmith shop, and then disappear again. Margaret learned from Mrs. Chen that he ran a small ranch, about 15 miles outside town, raising cattle and horses mostly by himself. "Keeps to himself, that one," Mrs. Chen said as they watched Thomas load supplies into his wagon one afternoon. "Been coming to town for about 3 years now. Never causes trouble, always pays his bills on time. Some folks think he's strange, because he doesn't drink or socialize much, but I think he's just private." Margaret found herself watching for him during her trips around town. There was something calming about his presence, the way he moved with quiet confidence, never hurried, but never wasting motion either. He reminded her of the few truly decent men she had known in her life, the ones who did their work without complaint and treated everyone with the same basic respect. The second time they spoke was outside the post office. Margaret was struggling with an armload of letters for Mrs. Chen's business correspondence when several envelopes scattered in the autumn wind. Thomas appeared beside her, gathering the wayward letters without being asked. "Thank you again," Margaret said as he handed them back to her. "I seem to be making a habit of dropping things around you." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe you just need better balanced loads." It was such a practical, matter-of-fact observation that Margaret laughed. the first genuine laugh she had had in months. "You're probably right. I'm used to carrying everything at once. Old habit from before." Thomas studied her face for a moment. "You worked in mills back east." It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded, waiting for the usual reaction, either dismissal or inappropriate interest. "Father worked in a mill in Pennsylvania before we moved west," Thomas said quietly. "Dangerous work. Takes strength to survive it." Margaret blinked in surprise. Most people saw mill work as something shameful, proof of low breeding. Thomas spoke of it like any other honest labor. "It was hard," she admitted. "But it taught me things. How to work efficiently, how to fix broken machinery, how to manage on very little money. Useful skills," Thomas said simply. "More useful than most of what passes for education around here." Before Margaret could respond, he tipped his hat again and walked away, leaving her standing there with a strange warmth spreading through her chest. The next week brought the first real storm of autumn. Margaret woke to the sound of wind howling around the boarding house and rain hammering against her small window. By breakfast time, water was dripping through the dining room ceiling in 3 different places. Mrs. Chen stood in the middle of the chaos, directing boarders to move tables and set out pots to catch the leaks. "The roof has been getting worse every year," she said to Margaret. "I keep meaning to get it fixed, but good workmen are expensive and hard to find." Margaret spent the morning mopping up water and reassuring worried boarders that the ceiling probably wouldn't collapse entirely. By afternoon, the storm had passed, but the damage was clear. Large water stains spread across the dining room ceiling, and the wallpaper was peeling in several places. She was standing outside, looking up at the damaged roof and wondering how they would afford repairs, when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Thomas Brennan pulled up in front of the boarding house, his wagon loaded with lumber and tools. "Heard in town that Mrs. Chen had roof trouble," he said, climbing down from the wagon seat. Margaret stared at him. "You came all the way from your ranch because of our roof?" "Storm hit my place too. Had to make repairs there first, but figured you might need help here." He started unloading lumber from the wagon. "Mind if I take a look?" Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, took one look at Thomas and his wagon full of supplies, and invited him in for coffee while they discussed the situation. Within an hour, he was up on the roof, assessing the damage and explaining to Mrs. Chen exactly what needed to be done. "I can't pay much," Mrs. Chen said honestly. "Business has been better lately, but not enough to afford what the town carpenters charge." "Wasn't looking for payment," Thomas replied. "Roof like this in weather like we get here, it's going to get worse fast if it's not fixed properly. Materials will cost something, but I can do the labor." Margaret watched this exchange with growing amazement. Thomas was offering to spend several days of his time for free, helping people he barely knew. It went against everything she had learned about how the world worked. The repair work took 3 days. Thomas arrived each morning before dawn and worked steadily until dark, refusing to come inside for meals beyond a quick cup of coffee and whatever Mrs. Chen could convince him to take with him. Margaret found herself working alongside him, holding boards steady while he nailed them in place, mixing mortar for the chimney repairs, fetching tools and supplies. She had expected him to protest her help. Most men considered construction work unsuitable for women. Instead, Thomas seemed to appreciate her assistance. He showed her how to measure and cut boards, explained why certain repairs were necessary, and trusted her to handle tasks that required precision and strength. "You're not afraid of hard work," he observed on the second day, watching her expertly handle a heavy piece of lumber. "Never could afford to be," Margaret replied, then caught herself. She had grown careful about revealing too much of her past to people, but Thomas just nodded. "Good thing. World's got enough people afraid of getting their hands dirty." They worked, mostly in comfortable silence, but during breaks they began to talk. Thomas told her about his ranch, about the challenges of working alone, about his plans to expand if he could save enough money. Margaret found herself sharing stories about the boarding house business, about her work helping other shop owners with their account books, about the satisfaction of solving problems through careful thinking and hard work. On the third day, as Thomas finished the last of the roof repairs, Margaret realized she was going to miss these conversations. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she had felt like someone saw her as more than just the rejected mail-order bride. Thomas talked to her like an equal, someone whose opinions and experiences mattered. As he packed up his tools, that evening Margaret worked up the courage to voice something that had been bothering her. "Thomas, why did you do this, really? You don't owe us anything." He paused in coiling up a length of rope and looked at her seriously. "Because it needed doing, and I could do it. Same reason you help Mrs. Chen with more than just your job duties. Same reason you do bookkeeping for half the businesses in town for practically nothing." He shouldered his tool bag. "Some folks think kindness has to have a reason behind it. I think kindness is reason enough." Margaret watched his wagon disappear into the twilight and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since Harold Pemberton had rejected her, she felt truly seen by another person. Not judged, not pitied, not dismissed, just seen for who she actually was. Maybe, she thought as she went inside to help serve dinner, there were different kinds of men in the world than she had previously known. October brought the first frost to Willow Creek, and with it changes that Margaret couldn't ignore. Thomas had started coming to town more often, not every 2 weeks now, but sometimes twice a week. He always had practical reasons for his visits. The blacksmith needed to repair a harness, or he needed supplies from the general store, or he had business at the bank. But somehow, these errands always seemed to take him past Mrs. Chen's boarding house around the time Margaret would be outside, hanging laundry or sweeping the front steps. "Good morning, Miss O'Sullivan," he would say, tipping his hat with that small smile that had become familiar. "Morning, Thomas," she would reply, and they would talk for a few minutes about the weather, or how the roof repairs were holding up, or some piece of town news. These conversations grew longer each time. Thomas would lean against the fence post, in no hurry to finish his business in town. Margaret would find excuses to linger outside even when her work was calling her back inside. Mrs. Chen noticed, of course. One afternoon, as Margaret watched Thomas's wagon disappear down Main Street, the older woman appeared beside her with a knowing look. "That young man seems to find a lot of reasons to visit town lately," Mrs. Chen observed. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "He's just being friendly." Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled. "Friendly? Is that what we're calling it?" Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Chen had disappeared back into the boarding house, leaving Margaret standing on the porch wondering if her growing feelings for Thomas were as obvious as they seemed to be. The truth was, she looked forward to his visits more than she cared to admit. Thomas treated her with a respect she had never experienced from any man. He listened when she talked, asked her opinions about things, and never made her feel foolish for her thoughts or ideas. When November arrived with an early snowfall, Thomas appeared at the boarding house carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might like this," he said, handing it to Margaret. Inside was a book, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. The cover was worn, but the pages were clean and intact. "I saw you reading whenever you had a free moment," Thomas explained. "Figured you might be running out of books from the town library." Margaret stared at the gift, touched beyond words. No one had ever bought her a book before. In her world, books were luxuries that came after food and rent and clothing. "Thomas, I can't accept this, it's too much. It's just a book," he said, but his eyes were warm. "Besides, I bought it from the old preacher who's moving back east. Cost me 50 cents and a promise to help him load his wagon. Hardly broke the bank." Margaret ran her fingers over the worn cover. "Thank you. No one's ever given me anything like this before." Something shifted in Thomas's expression. "That's a shame. Woman who reads as much as you do deserves to have books of her own." That evening, Margaret sat in her small room reading by lamplight, but her mind kept wandering from Elizabeth Bennet's story to the man who had thought to bring her this gift. There was something building between them, something she had never experienced before. Not the desperate hope she had felt with Harold's letters, but something deeper and more solid. A week later, Thomas arrived in town during a fierce snowstorm. Margaret was surprised to see his wagon pull up outside the boarding house. The weather was too dangerous for unnecessary travel. "What are you doing out in this?" she asked, hurrying out to help him with his horse. "Came to check on you," he said simply, as if traveling 15 miles through a blizzard was the most natural thing in the world. "Check on me?" Thomas secured his horse and looked at her seriously. "Storm like this, it makes a man think about the people who matter to him. Wanted to make sure you were safe." The words hung between them in the swirling snow. People who matter to him. Margaret felt something warm and frightening bloom in her chest. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "But you shouldn't have risked the journey." "Worth the risk," Thomas replied, and the way he looked at her made it clear he wasn't just talking about checking on her safety. Mrs. Chen insisted Thomas stay the night rather than attempt the dangerous journey home. She prepared a room for him and invited him to join them for dinner. Margaret found herself nervous in a way she had never been before, acutely aware of Thomas's presence at the dinner table, of the way he complimented Mrs. Chen's cooking, of how naturally he fit into their small domestic world. After dinner, when the other boarders had retired to their rooms, Thomas lingered in the sitting room where Margaret was mending clothes by the fire. "Mind if I sit with you for a while?" he asked. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Thomas settled into the chair across from her, and they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the wind howling outside. "Margaret," Thomas said finally, and something in his tone made her look up from her sewing. "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about you a lot lately, more than I probably should." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I know your situation here is complicated. I know what happened with Pemberton, and I know how people in town talk." Margaret's stomach dropped. Here it came, the polite rejection, the explanation of why he couldn't be associated with someone like her. "But I don't care about any of that," Thomas continued. "What I care about is the woman I've gotten to know these past few months. The woman who works harder than anyone I've ever met, who's kinder than she has any reason to be after what she's been through, who's smart enough to help half the businesses in town run better." Margaret stared at him, afraid to breathe. "What I'm trying to say is, I'd like to court you properly, if you'll have me." The sewing fell from Margaret's hands. "Court me? I know I'm not much," Thomas rushed on. "I've got a small ranch, nothing fancy. I'm not educated like Pemberton or wealthy like some of the men in town. But I can offer you an honest life, a partnership, someone who sees your worth." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. "Thomas, you don't understand. I'm not the kind of woman men court. I'm a mill girl, a rejected mail-order bride. People in town don't know you like I do." Thomas interrupted gently. "They see what happened with Pemberton and think it says something about you. I see what happened with Pemberton and think it says something about him." He stood up and moved, to kneel beside her chair, taking her work-roughened hands in his own. "Margaret O'Sullivan, you are the strongest, most capable woman I've ever known. You've built a life here from nothing, earned respect through hard work, and shown more grace under pressure than most people manage in a lifetime. If Pemberton couldn't see that, he's a fool." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, his calloused from ranch work, hers marked by years of mill labor and domestic work. Two pairs of working hands that had known struggle and hardship. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Really sure?" "Because I don't think I could bear to be rejected again." Thomas squeezed her hands gently. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "You're not being rejected, Margaret. You're being chosen by someone who knows exactly who you are and wants you anyway." Margaret felt the last of her walls crumble. For months, she had been building a new life alone, convinced that she would always be alone. Now here was this good man, offering not just love but partnership, not just acceptance but genuine appreciation for who she was. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Thomas smiled, not the small, careful smile she was used to, but a wide, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Good," he said simply. "That's real good." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside by the fire, Margaret felt warmer and safer than she had in years. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, She was no longer the rejected mail-order bride. She was a woman being courted by a man who saw her true value. Spring came early to Willow Creek in 1888, and with it came Margaret's wedding day. She stood in her small room at the boarding house, looking at herself in the cracked mirror above her washstand. The dress she wore wasn't fancy, just her best blue wool dress with new white lace collar that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew. But it was clean and mended, and most importantly, it was chosen by a woman who was loved for exactly who she was. The past months of courtship had been unlike anything Margaret had ever imagined. Thomas visited every Sunday after church, and they would walk together through town or sit on the boarding house porch, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his plans for the ranch, his dreams of expanding the herd and maybe buying the neighboring property someday. She shared her ideas about better ways to organize the ranch accounts, about breeding programs she had read about in farming journals, about the small improvements that could make a big difference over time. What surprised Margaret most was how naturally they worked together. When Thomas mentioned needing to repair his barn roof before winter, Margaret had suggested a different approach based on what she had learned watching him fix the boarding house. When she worried about Mrs. Chen managing alone after the wedding, Thomas had helped interview and train a new assistant for the older woman. The gossips in town had plenty to say about their courtship, of course. Some called it scandalous that the rejected mail-order bride had snared another man so quickly. Others whispered that Thomas must be desperate to settle for damaged goods. But Margaret had learned to let their words roll off her back like water, off a duck's feathers. What mattered was how Thomas looked at her, like she was the most valuable thing in his world. What mattered was how he listened to her ideas and actually used them. What mattered was how he had never once made her feel like she should be grateful that someone like him would want someone like her. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Margaret, dear, are you ready?" Mrs. Chen's voice called from the hallway. Margaret opened the door to find Mrs. Chen holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. The older woman's eyes were bright with tears. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Chen said, adjusting Margaret's collar, like a woman who knows her own worth. Margaret hugged her friend tightly. Mrs. Chen had become like a mother to her over these months, offering advice and support without judgment. The boarding house had been her sanctuary when she needed one most. "Thank you for everything," Margaret whispered. "For giving me work when I needed it, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." "You earned every bit of what you got," Mrs. Chen replied firmly. "Don't you forget that." The wedding ceremony took place in the boarding house parlor, with the traveling preacher who visited Willow Creek once a month performing the service. It was a small gathering: Mrs. Chen, a few of the kinder boarders, Pete from the lumber mill, and old Mr. Jenkins from the hardware store. Margaret had helped all of them with various problems over the past year, and they had come to show their support. Notably absent were the respectable ladies of Willow Creek and Harold Pemberton. Margaret didn't mind. She preferred to be surrounded by people who knew the value of honest work and genuine friendship. Thomas stood waiting for her in his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished. When Margaret entered the parlor on Mrs. Chen's arm, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Thomas Brennan and Margaret O'Sullivan in holy matrimony." Margaret barely heard the formal words. She was too focused on Thomas's steady brown eyes, on the way he held her hands like they were something precious, on the quiet certainty in his voice when he promised to love and honor her for the rest of his life. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her softly, and Margaret felt like her life was finally beginning for real. The celebration afterward was simple, but joyful. Mrs. Chen had prepared a special dinner, and someone had brought out a fiddle for dancing. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years, swept up in the warmth of genuine friendships and the solid presence of her new husband beside her. As the evening wound down, Thomas loaded Margaret's few belongings into his wagon. Everything she owned in the world fit easily in 2 small trunks and a carpet bag. But as she looked around the boarding house one last time, she felt rich beyond measure. The ride to Thomas's ranch took 2 hours through beautiful countryside that would now be her home. Margaret had visited once during their courtship, but seeing it now as Thomas's wife felt different. The small log house sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, with a barn and several outbuildings scattered around. It wasn't grand, but it was solid and well-maintained, a home built by hard work and careful planning. "Not much to look at yet," Thomas said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but we'll build it up together." Margaret looked around at the ranch that would be her new world and felt a deep sense of peace. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The early days of marriage brought adjustments that Margaret hadn't expected. Thomas had been living alone for several years, and his household routines reflected a bachelor's priorities. Margaret's organizational skills, honed by years of managing on very little, transformed the ranch operations almost immediately. She set up proper account books for tracking expenses and income, organized the storage areas so supplies could be found quickly, and established systems for everything from feeding schedules to equipment maintenance. Thomas watched these changes with amazement and growing respect. "How did you know to do that?" he asked one evening, watching her mark notes in a ledger about which cows were due to calve. "Same way you know how to fix a broken harness or predict the weather," Margaret replied. "You learn what works and you remember it." But Margaret contributed, more than just organizational skills. Her years of working with machinery in the mills had given her an intuitive understanding of how things worked and how to fix them when they broke. She could repair a broken pump handle, adjust a loose gate, or jury-rig a temporary solution to almost any mechanical problem. Thomas began consulting her on ranch decisions, valuing her practical intelligence and different perspective. When they discussed expanding the herd, Margaret suggested they start with quality breeding stock rather than quantity, a strategy that proved profitable within 2 years. The town's attitude toward Margaret began to shift as word spread about the ranch's success. The same people who had whispered about the rejected mail-order bride now nodded respectfully when they saw Mrs. Brennan in town conducting business. Margaret's reputation for honest dealing and smart financial advice made her someone worth knowing, regardless of her past. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after her wedding, Margaret encountered Harold Pemberton outside the bank. She was depositing the proceeds from a cattle sale, and he was conducting his own business. They hadn't spoken since that awful day when he had rejected her. Harold tipped his hat politely. "Mrs. Brennan, I hear congratulations are in order. Your ranch is doing quite well." Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of the condescension she remembered. Instead, she saw something that might have been regret. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. We've been blessed with good fortune." "Yes, well." Harold cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I hope you'll accept my wishes for your continued success." Margaret nodded graciously. "That's kind of you." As she walked away, Margaret realized she felt nothing toward Harold. No anger, no satisfaction at proving him wrong, no lingering hurt. He had become irrelevant to her life, a minor character in someone else's story. That evening, as she and Thomas sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Margaret reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. The rejection that had seemed like the end of the world had actually been the beginning of something far better than she had ever dared to dream. "Penny, for your thoughts," Thomas said, reaching over to take her hand. Margaret smiled, looking out over the land they had built together through hard work and mutual respect, just thinking about how sometimes getting exactly what you think you want isn't nearly as good as getting what you actually need. Thomas squeezed her hand. "And what did you need?" Margaret looked at her husband, this good man who had seen her value when others couldn't, who had chosen her not despite her past but because of who it had made her, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. "A partner," she said simply. "Someone who knew that the best things in life are built, not given." Thomas smiled and pulled her closer. In the distance, cattle lowed softly in the evening air, and Margaret O'Sullivan Brennan knew she was finally truly home.